Hello, and welcome to the Eras of Western Women, a limited series CFD podcast. During these episodes, we celebrate Cheyenne Frontier Day's designation of 2024 as the Year of the Cowgirl. I'm Diane Schober, the Executive Director at the Wyoming Office of Tourism. I'm a lifelong fan of Cheyenne Frontier Days, and certainly, as a woman, very interested in these women of the West.
A part of Western history, a legend walking tall. Cheyenne Frontier Days, the daddy of all.
Joining with me today is Mike Castle. Mike is the Associate Director and Curator of Collections at the Cheyenne Frontier Days Old West Museum. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Diane. Nice to see you
Nice
again.
to see you too. So during these 4 episodes, Mike and I are having conversations as we celebrate the Year of the Cowgirl in the eras of women from diverse backgrounds who've made history in our Western way of life. If you joined us for episode 1, we covered the time frame from 1800 to 1895. But today we're going to be talking about a much more concentrated era of time, 1895 through 1930, which really was known as the era of the cowgirl. And as a curator here at the Cheyenne Frontier Days Old West Museum, and sitting here in this beautiful room surrounded by Frontier Park right on the grounds, the sacred ground, there's a lot that happened
Oh
that
my
shaped
goodness.
this.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much that happened here. And this is where it gets fun because now all of a sudden we have many, many names and many more personalities to start adding to the story.
And some very colorful characters, as well as, amazing things that they were doing. So
Right.
let's kick off with the Irwin sisters. And we certainly, if you're a CFD fan and historical
Oh, yes.
buff about Cheyenne Frontier Days, you know the name Irwin is closely related here and embedded deep in the history of Cheyenne Frontier Days, but also the Denver Post relay races. Now,
Absolutely.
you'd share with us, for the listeners out there, what these sisters were doing and about these relay races.
Okay, well, to begin with, first of all, it's kind of it's a natural thing for the Irwin daughters to actually get involved with rodeo and the sport. Their dad
Right.
wouldn't have had it any other way.
Yes,
But
it was
they
in their DNA.
It was in their DNA. They had no choice but to get involved, and dad had something to do with it. Well, here's the fun part about this. They basically are starting to represent a group of women that are finally the second generation of settlers that have been out here in the American West. Their mothers and their fathers came out here and started ranching, and some of them had experience, but most of them had to adapt this to the lifestyle of the countryside that we're living in. When they did that, everybody in the family had to participate to make the ranch function. So moms, dads, kids, and it didn't matter who it was, the children all had to be involved, and male or female, they were doing the same jobs.
Yep, it was a family affair.
It was a family affair, and that was across the board, no matter where you were in
Yes.
Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, Nebraska, or anywhere in the West, you had the whole family participating. So these girls, and everybody that I'm going to mention, learned how to do these jobs through practical experience. They knew how to pick up riding, they knew their roping skills. They were just as good hands as their brothers and their fathers, and they had to be.
It relevant even today
Absolutely.
for ranchers making their living here in Wyoming. It is a family affair. Everybody is working and contributing to the success of their family business.
And this is a family
It is a
business.
family business.
And then we get into the Irwins, which are a special case.
Yes,
Oh my
yes.
goodness, are they
So let's
special?
talk about those girls.
Well, Joella, Frances, and Pauline are the 3 daughters that belong to C.B. Irwin himself. Now, C.B. was a contestant here at Cheyenne Frontier Days, but he was also a stock contractor. So he gave a lot of the stock animals and otherwise. And he also had this wonderful vision, and involved with Cheyenne Frontier Days as he was, that he loved to take this on the road with him so that he and his family would be able to make some extra money. So he actually even had the Irwin, with his brother Frank, the Irwin brothers Cheyenne Frontier Days Wild West show that toured the United States.
As a marketer, that was, those were our marketing vehicles, but it was really
Yes.
engaging and educating people about the ways of the West and encouraging them to understand more about what was happening out here.
Absolutely. And so Cheyenne Frontier Days had a little bit of gas about, them using the name, but they kind of realized what was going on. And
Yes.
so that continued for many, many years. Now, what's fun about the daughters is that Cheyenne Frontier Days needs to get a little credit for allowing women to compete as competitors in the rodeo many years earlier than most people give them credit for. We actually had the first year was 1897, and cowboys were the focus, along with many of the events that they had. But it was the very next year in 1898 that Cheyenne Frontier Days committee decided they were going to introduce horse racing. And it's not only for men, but they decided to open it for women who are also, as I said, adept riders and absolutely phenomenal athletes to go ahead and compete for prizes, money, and trophies at Cheyenne Frontier Days. And it's in this environment. We know that some of the Irwin daughters were involved very young, but that was a little bit early in 1898. About 1900, some of the older daughters, actually one of the first women in the Irwin family who married in, Marguerite, joined them and became one of the cowgirl champions at the very beginning because of her horse racing skills. And then all the other daughters started coming up too and doing all of these races. And there were quarter-mile pony races, half-mile pony races. But then they started coming up with this whole idea of the relay race, where you had the teams of horses, 4 of them, and you would have one rider for each one of those 4 horses. But every time you made a quarter-mile circuit around the track, you had to get off the horse, unsaddle it, put the saddle on the other horse, and then ride off on the next horse. And so just like a relay race where you'd hand the baton off, we're just handing off horses. And this became something that became rather remarkable. Now, Marguerite was the first. Again, she married into the Irwin family. She was the first champion, and we have her trophy from the first year that it was held in 1904.
Right here at the Old West Museum?
Yes, we do.
Excellent.
And so that's a neat thing. And we put that out on occasion, and it's really fun to see that. But what's also a lot of fun is that the Irwin daughters all trained with each other, and they did other things besides doing the relay races. They did trick riding and trick roping, but the racing is their specialty. And so these young ladies became lethal competitors, and they would start traveling with their dad.
As an all-female team.
As an all-female team. And they didn't all compete at the same time because Pauline is the oldest, so she was riding first. Then you would have Joella, who was very good, who would come up next. And then finally Frances, who would race, but she'd rather do more of the trick riding and stuff like that instead. So it was a very interesting family affair. But the Denver Post down in Denver became a very strong promoter for Cheyenne Frontier Days. And they thought that this race was so exciting and so dynamic that they would start creating a trophy for it. And the Denver Post Ladies Relay Race became a coveted prize for female athletes. And again, rodeo is one of the first, if not the first sport where women athletes were recognized as legitimate competitors to be in the arena at the same time as men.
Breaking barriers.
Breaking barriers. And rodeo is it because it goes back to that whole interplay on how women were involved with the rodeo lifestyle, the ranching lifestyle. They were right there with the men, and so they were able to compete right beside them as well.
Well, I think that is just such an interesting story. I mean, you think about the dangers of trick riding, and we have so many safety nets around it today that you're watching and making sure, but then it was just right out on the wide open prairies. And
Yes.
I think that the relay races then must have been amazing to watch.
They are. As a matter
Yeah.
of fact, we're very lucky. Here at the Old West Museum, we have the earliest film footage from Cheyenne Frontier Days is from 1911, and it catches one of these fantastic races with Joella, one of the Irwin daughters, actually doing the relay race. And you can see it's a pretty hairy affair, if you'll excuse the
Yeah.
term, because it's fast, it's furious. CB's out there on the track with his daughter flipping the saddles over, but these could come loose if they're not synced properly. The women could get trampled by the horses. There is risk that these women were undertaking, and the speeds that they're attaining with these horses are phenomenal. It's just so much fun to
The
watch.
grit and sustenance that they had is truly remarkable.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's fun. Then all of these girls competed against each other. And then they also competed against other women who would travel to Wyoming for this opportunity. And they would also travel to other locations like Pendleton and Calgary, because once you got a good team and a good group of racers, there was good money involved.
Yeah.
And that's, of course, what a lot of women got involved with rodeo with as well, is because it was a great way to supplement what they were already doing on the homestead.
Of course. Just tell us a little bit about Frances, their youngest, with her longhorn steer.
Yes, yes. Oh, we have some wonderful pictures of her. Now, Joella was considered by many to be she was beautiful, and she was everything you could possibly imagine for a rodeo princess. Frances, she was the smallest of the daughters, and she kind of kept to the background as as her sisters went through the races. She tried it once or twice, but she really enjoyed doing the trick roping. And yes, her famous steer, and I don't even remember what this poor steer's name is, but amazing, a Texas Longhorn steer that she could ride out into the middle of the arena, and she could stand on its back and do all kinds of rope trips, jumping through the loops, and all this other kind of stuff, dancing on his back, and he'd have no problem with it. He was grateful to be a stage.
I'm sure it was a great, very much a crowd favorite when
Yes,
she would come in on that Longhorn steer.
absolutely.
What an amazing family and what an amazing group of daughters and women blazing trails in the rodeo world and in the world of athletics. And as we said, just setting a
Mhm.
new stage for women
Absolutely.
and raising the awareness of women in the sport of rodeo, which is still very near and dear to us today.
Absolutely, but they
Um,
still had barriers to break.
yes.
They still had barriers to break, even in rodeo, such as men were the only ones that were allowed to ride bucking horses until somebody was able to broach that and break that glass ceiling. And that's also a very interesting story.
Well, tell us about that. You've got us intrigued now.
All right. Well, okay, about the same time that you have Joella and her sisters, Frances, riding with C.B. Irwin and his family, saddle bronc riding was considered to be a very manly sport, dangerous, and something, men were getting hurt, and it was a kind of expected. And again, there still was this idea that women, even though they were involved with rodeo, that was possibly something that they should not do. A woman disagreed with them. Her name was Bertha Kaepernick. And she was a young woman, a young ranching woman, who actually came to Cheyenne Frontier Days in 1904 with no idea that she was going to be doing anything special except for riding horses to the rodeo and watching a wonderful event. She wanted to get involved with the
She was
horse
here as a
races.
spectator.
She was here as a
Okay.
spectator. So she rode from Sterling, Colorado on the back of a horse all the way here to Cheyenne, Wyoming in time to see the
And
rodeo.
that's about how many miles?
Oh, that's over 100 miles.
Okay.
Right. So she was a
Mhm.
dedicated person to
She
begin
was.
with. Well, as the story goes, apparently Cheyenne Frontier Days in 1904 had one of the first, and anybody that's involved with Frontier Days know this, it gets a little rainy sometimes and it gets super muddy. And this
Can.
was exactly one of those types of years. And the cowboys were starting to protest that they did not think it was safe to actually try and ride bucking horses in a muddy arena. And so they started protesting. And Bertha Kaepernick, who is, of course, again, one of these women that had all of these skills, just like the men did, thought to herself, that's insane. I want to see what's going to happen. So she went up to the organizing committee and said, I'll do it. If the men won't, I will. And they said, well, go ahead. We'll be willing to let you do it. And so she did. So they brought her out, and here she is in this dress. She has a riding hat. She has her long blouse on, and she has a skirt on. And she gets on the back of this horse, and in front of a crowd that had no idea this was going to happen, she rides this horse to a standstill. I mean, people were shocked that they were going to let this happen, but she insisted that this was something that she could do. And boy, did she put on a show. And it was amazing.
What a treat it would have been to have been there that day in the stands watching that. First ever, breaking history and seeing her. I bet all those other cowboys who thought it was too muddy got all of a sudden they got very like
Yes.
we will not be bested by Bertha. We are going to get on the back of these horses and we're going to
Oh,
do our best.
yeah, they basically came around, as you imagine, rather quickly,
I
and
am
the
sure.
show went on. So
Yes, and the show went on.
and it was an a mark. It was 1904 was a remarkable year. But I mean, just the fact that Bertha Kaepernick, without even really knowing she was going to do it and intending to do it, did break a ceiling and then set the stage for the next 30 years in Cheyenne and rodeo across the nation.
Well, she didn't have many peers that were doing this kind of work at that time. I mean, she really did set the stage and open the doors for what other women could do.
Absolutely no. There were no other women that were known as riders of bucking broncs, but you're correct. From that point forward, it became a rather common thing in rodeos across the United States, particularly here at Cheyenne Frontier Days, that you couldn't have a show unless you had women bronc riders. And the women shared the same risk as the men did. We had women like Goldie St. Clair that actually got landed on by her horse in 1911 at Madison Square Gardens, and they thought she was going to be dead. That happened early in February of 1911. Well, by July of 1911, she was healthy enough to ride both days at Cheyenne Frontier
So
Days.
tough. So
Oh,
tough.
very tough women. They could take a hit and they could do it just like the men.
So Bertha competed and she had a history. Then after she was no longer competing, she continued her career in the rodeo arena. And tell us a little bit about that. as an active pickup man.
Oh, yes. Well, she did. She actually did work to try and keep the cowboys safe. And, again, she used the skills that she was able to learn on her own family's ranch to help keep the rodeo going.
Mhm.
And, the pickup men at this same time, C.B. Irwin was one of the pickup men. They had a lot of people that were involved with the rodeo that are in our Hall of Fame that were in the background, keeping the cowboys safe and keeping things moving. And she was right there. And of course, when she was doing this, she wasn't doing this in the skirt and the blouse or
Yeah.
anything else like that. She was wearing the clothing that people wore on the ranch. So she was wearing pants. And there were many people in the stands who didn't even know she was a woman that was out there helping out with the men. And
I when I read a little bit about her background and read that she was a tour guide in Yellowstone National Park, I thought she must have a great personality to be able to engage with visitors and then be, this tough competitor. But
absolutely.
there are many others that were competing and creating the greater awareness around rodeo during this era of the cowgirl,
Mhm.
during this time frame. So let's talk about a couple of the others. Who are some of your other favorites that you'd like to
Oh
bring up
my
today?
goodness. This is hard because we had hundreds of young women that started becoming involved with Cheyenne Frontier Days. Most of them only lasted for 2 or 3 years
Mhm.
before they had other obligations, or usually when it happens, if a woman became married, it wasn't uncommon for them to leave what they were doing to go attend the family. So that was still common even at
Mhm.
this point in time. But you had a lot of married women that still continued
Yep.
regardless. And so there were some really big ones. Now, probably one of the biggest that everybody loves to talk about in as kind of a wonderful mystery is Prairie Rose Henderson. She's one of my favorite.
Yes, very mysterious. I got
She's
intrigued too reading
interesting.
about her.
Yeah, so she's a woman that her first appearance is probably around 1910. And, she's given credit by a lot of newspapers for actually being at Cheyenne Frontier Days and being the first woman to actually write at Cheyenne Frontier Days because she challenged the rules because they didn't say women could be there. Well, that story originated in a New Jersey newspaper in 1947 and then just got picked up on and people ran with it. So I don't know where that got started.
Yeah.
It certainly wasn't in front of Cheyenne's newspapers or otherwise. But when she started in 1910, she was actually a woman that was working with C.B. Irwin and part of his Wild West show. But then it becomes rather interesting to find out who she is. She was a phenomenal writer. She was one of the crowd favorites. She dressed very flashy. She was fantastic, wore the most gaudy outfits you could possibly imagine. And she rode astride the horse just like Bertha did, but she had Turkish trousers, which look like a skirt when you're standing. But when you get on the horse, it splits on both
Okay.
sides.
All right.
So it was perfectly, it was
Mhm.
perfectly appropriate, and everybody thought this was marvelous. Now, what's interesting about her is that we don't know if she's one person or two or more. Because the
And the mystery
the
ensues.
mystery ensues. Well, the family itself has different stories about this, but even in the newspapers, about 1910 to 1911, all the way up until 1912, she is described as a woman with reddish brown hair. So why would that be any different? Well, she goes by a name, but they finally released what her married name was. Um, and it's released when she's down at another show down in Denver. Her name, and let me go ahead and make sure that I can find it. They refer to her as, let's see here, and I apologize for not having this right on the tip of my tongue. Uh, but she was Mrs. John Judd. All right,
All
so
right.
that's one name. And then she's never mentioned by that name in any Cheyenne paper before because she's just Prairie Rose Henderson. And so she's just absolutely marvelous. But then around 1920, and she continues to ride, around 1920, all of a sudden she's being described by one character who's writing for the papers about all the colors of the rodeo, describes her beautiful blonde tresses. And this is a very interesting thing too, because if she had reddish brown hair in 1910, but then in 1920 has blonde hair, this is something that cowgirls did not do. They didn't wear makeup. They didn't change their hair color. So how does this woman now have a completely different hairstyle? Maybe she was out in the sun too long. But then as it goes on, she continued to ride through the 1920s as an exhibition rider, and then has a very interesting and sad end. Now, as it happens, the story that we have in Wyoming that follows her is that after she retired, she was Mrs. John Clayton.
So no longer Prairie Rose Henderson,
No
no
longer
longer Mrs.
Prairie,
John Judd.
no longer Mrs. John Judd, but she's referred to as to, I'm sorry, I said Mrs. John Clayton. She was Mrs. Rose Coleman.
Rose Coleman
Rose
now.
Coleman.
Okay.
And she actually lives around Rock Springs, and she's on a small ranch north of there with her husband. And in 1932, while he's out fighting fires, it comes out that he's also a possible cattle rustler. And this is in the wintertime. And the police come to her house looking for him. She tells them that he's out fighting fires. So as they go out and pursue him, a big snowstorm comes out, and that's the last anybody ever sees of her. All right, for a long period of time. So it is for another 7 years that nobody knows what happens to Rose Coleman until a Basque shepherd is wandering around in the area of their ranch and they find a skeleton out there on the plains.
And how did they identify that skeleton?
Now, this is the story gets so interesting.
Yes.
Some accounts basically say that her brother that came down basically identified her by the clothes that she was wearing. That's in the Casper Star Tribune.
That's account number one.
That's account number one. And other accounts that are published later say that she was identified by her buckle. But unfortunately, Cheyenne Frontier Days does not give out, and it was her Cheyenne Frontier Days trophy buckle, but Cheyenne Frontier Days did not have the habit of giving out trophy buckles for anyone until the 1960s.
Much later.
Much later. So what
Decades
exactly
later,
happened?
yes.
Well, if we circle back around to her brother's tale, he says that he believes that those are her bones, and that's all that's left, and some fragments of clothes. And apparently she wandered out in the storm, as can happen, has
Yes.
been told, that if you get turned around out there, you could wander in the wrong direction, thinking you're heading the right
Hypothermia.
way.
Mhm.
And obviously this is what happened to this per individual. He said that he identified it by her clothes, but when he was asked, how it's really sad, we know her as Prairie Rose Henderson, he says she never went by that name.
Well,
And
she
so that's
definitely was an interesting one in the West, wasn't she?
right. And then we go back into the 1970s when one of the family members from the Irwins is recounting the family lore. They mentioned that one of the early women that was in the rodeo called Prairie Rose Henderson disappeared from their knowledge in about the 1920s. And that's where I'm getting interested. They still have a Prairie Rose Henderson, but they said the woman that they knew as Prairie Rose Henderson disappeared and may have been a victim of murder.
Oh, my goodness.
So that makes me interested.
This is a Women of the West cold case mysteries yet to be solved,
Well,
right?
we need to go ahead and
Yeah.
have this investigated
Yeah.
because now are we talking about one woman, two women,
Or three women.
or three women? We really don't know the story.
That could be a whole other podcast, Mike, that we could delve into
Oh
that
my
one,
gosh,
right?
that one is so much fun.
Yeah, it really is.
So she's fun just because of the mystery of who she is, but
Of
she's still
course.
a known quantity because we have her in pictures, postcards, and the one last thing. One account in Lander says that the sheriff saw her in Riverton, and she said in 1932, Rose Coleman said that she was leaving to California because she was leaving her husband. So did she get out there? I have no idea. We don't know who or what happened to this woman. So she's one of my favorite because there's so many things more to know about who she was.
Yes, lots to discover.
Lots of
And hopefully over time we'll learn a little bit more about her as we dig into it. I know there's a couple of others, and
Oh my
let's
goodness.
talk about our most beloved cowgirl in her day, Mabel Strickland.
Who could you not love more than Mabel Strickland?
Why was Mabel so beloved?
Okay, well, first of all, her husband and she both were very good competitors, and they were well known in the national rodeo circuit. But what she had was that perfect camera face. She was beautiful. She was a wonderful looking cowgirl, but she was incredibly tough. So she was elegant when she needed to be. She was a trick rider. She was a horse racer. She rode bucking horses, and she even steer wrestled from time to time. And then as soon as she was done, she was almost like a glamour queen at the same time.
Wow,
So
very
she was
adept at many things.
very adept at many things. And so many people remember her very vividly as being the quintessential cowgirl of the 1920s
Mhm.
because she looked in good in front of a camera, she looked in good in front of the audience, and she was still every bit the cowgirl that everybody would come to expect from a tough competitor. So
Wow.
she was absolutely marvelous.
And then let's talk about Miss Wyoming, Helen Bonham.
Now, she's an interesting character, too. Now, we like to, Cheyenne Frontier Days had been looking for a queen to represent the rodeo. It was actually Joseph M. Carey, our governor at that time, that thought that rodeo should have a queen. That would be a representation. Somebody would help market.
Like an ambassador.
An ambassador,
Mhm.
absolutely. But we didn't get one. Until 1919, we had a gentleman from the Union Pacific Railroad who thought it would be a great idea to have a young woman that would represent Cheyenne Frontier Days to the rest of the country. And they were going to use it as a marketing ploy to get tickets for people to purchase from around the country on the Union Pacific Railroad.
To come into Cheyenne.
To come into Cheyenne, because everybody knew about it, and it was a great way to do this. Well, Helen Bonham, again, is a ranching woman. She had a very good skill. And even before she was selected as Miss Wyoming, she was a horse racer and a steer roper herself. So she had a lot of these skills. But again, she was this perfect place. Now, what's fun about this is that they made the point in the newspapers that if they weren't going to find, they were basically looking from Chicago to Los Angeles for the perfect American cowgirl, the Remington type of girl that would be perfect and have.
These are what the Union Pacific
This is
included
the
as they were
Union
scouting
Pacific.
for this.
They were
This
scouting
rodeo
for her.
queen.
Yes, they were scouting for this rodeo queen. She definitely would have a whole podcast on her own. Well, this got the women of Wyoming rather incensed that they would consider anybody else but a Wyoming woman to
I'm
represent Cheyenne.
incensed even knowing that they were considering it.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
this is how the women of Wyoming dealt with it.
Yes.
The president of the YWCA in Cheyenne wrote a letter, and as the governor, Governor Carey, the son of Joseph M. Carey, was coming out of the Capitol building, two cowgirls raced across downtown Cheyenne, cutting across lawns, and one of them rode her horse right up the steps of the Capitol building to the governor and handed him a note demanding that the Cheyenne Frontier Days in the Union Pacific pick a Wyoming woman to do this job.
That's how we get things done.
That's how we get things done. And then she rode away. And believe it or not, that's how Helen Bonham rose to the top. She had a poster made for her, and everybody was really excited about what her potential was, but they didn't know what that was going to be. Originally, she was on the poster, and she kind of went around the area showing off the poster, so on and so forth. The next year, the Union Pacific launched this fantastic campaign to take her by rail across the United States to meet huge people in American politics and bring them back to Cheyenne. And so she was given a free train ride from Cheyenne to Omaha, to Chicago, to Washington, D.C., to Philadelphia, New York, St. Louis, and made a huge circuit of the United States. And in each location, she was able to get on a horse and try and be the ambassador for Cheyenne Frontier Days. She carried a personal invitation for President Woodrow Wilson. And so it was at the time that he was sick, so she didn't get a chance to talk to him, but she tried to give him an invitation, and she tried to give an invitation to Warren G. Harding, who was going to run against him, but he was in Congress, so she attempted to ride her horse up the steps of the nation's capital.
Following suit for what had happened in Wyoming.
What happened in Wyoming?
Yes.
The Capitol Police were not pleased. They turned her around. And so she went in and talked to Frank Mondale, our senator, instead.
Mhm.
But these kind of things were a great boost to Cheyenne and Cheyenne Frontier Days, but nothing really topped what happened when she got to New York City. She rode through the streets of New York City on horseback from Pennsylvania Station to the gigantic McAlpin Hotel, which is one of the tallest buildings in the world, gigantic structure. She rides her horse into the lobby of the hotel, signs in, then rides her horse into the elevator, and then goes all the way to the top floor and gets out on the roof of her horse in the middle of the Manhattan skyline. Now, fortunately, a Hollywood actor by the name of Fred Stone gave his horse Star to her to do this. Very well-trained horse. But yes, she rode a horse into the elevator, rode up to the top floor, and they have pictures of her looking out over the skyline on horseback about 30 stories in the air.
Eras of women, Western women. I mean, that really is a great culmination for this time period.
Oh, my gosh,
To
it's
have the
amazing.
platform to be able to go across the United States, a woman from Wyoming, talking about the West, talking about the things that are happening in the world of rodeo and our Western way of life. I think she's a great woman to conclude this particular era and this episode.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Thank you for sharing so much about her with us, Mike. We appreciate that. Certainly, if you're interested in learning more about these women who were influential to Cheyenne Frontier Days and the rodeo world, you can visit the Old West Museum right here in Cheyenne, Wyoming, the Cheyenne Frontier Days Old West Museum. Thanks so much, Mike.
My pleasure.
Now, this concludes our episode, and we invite you to please join us again in our next episode as we cover a new era of Western women, the third era of 1930 to 1960. Thank you.
A part of Western history, a legend walking tall. Cheyenne Frontier Days, the daddy